The Montana Territory stretched endlessly beneath a pewter sky, its peaks crowned with snow that had never known the touch of spring. Pine forests stood like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with frost, while the wind sang its lonely song through the valleys below. This was God's country, they said, though God seemed to have forgotten to make it hospitable to man. In the winter of 1887, the land showed its teeth. Ice crystals hung in the air like suspended diamonds, and the rivers ran sluggish beneath their frozen armor. The mountains rose sharp and unforgiving against the horizon, their passes treacherous with snow that could swallow a man whole. Bears prowled the lower slopes, driven down by hunger, while wolves sang their hunger to the moon. It was a place that demanded respect, or it would claim your bones for its collection. Elias Hart understood this truth better than most. He'd made his home here, far from the reach of civilization's gentle lies. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of ancient pines, built with his own hands from logs he'd felled and notched himself. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, the only sign of human habitation for miles in any direction. Inside, bear pelts covered the walls, and his rifle hung ready above the door. Everything about the place spoke of solitude, of a man who'd chosen the company of mountains over men. He stood now at the edge of a frozen creek, studying tracks in the snow. Grizzly, male, probably 800 pounds. The beast had passed through at dawn, heading north toward the higher elevations. Elias ran his fingers through his dark beard, calculating. 3 days since he'd taken his last bear. The fur traders in Pine Ridge would be expecting him soon, at 35. Elias carried himself like a man who'd seen too much of the world's darkness. His gray eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of a soldier who'd never quite left the battlefield. Shrapnel scars traced pale lines across his left temple, souvenirs from Antietam, while his right shoulder bore the puckered mark of a Confederate bullet. The war had ended 22 years ago, but for men like Elias, some wars never truly ended. They just changed battlefields. He'd come to Montana to forget, to lose himself in the endless wilderness where the only sounds were natural ones. The crack of ice, the whisper of snow, the scream of eagles. Here, there were no bugles, no dying boys calling for their mothers, no stench of gunpowder and blood, just the clean, sharp smell of pine and the honest violence of predator and prey. 20 miles south, where the mountains grudgingly gave way to a narrow valley, the logging town of Pine Ridge clung to existence like moss to a rock. It was a rough collection of wooden buildings, hastily constructed to serve the lumber camps that fed America's endless appetite for timber. The main street was little more than a muddy track, frozen solid now in winter's grip. Saloons outnumbered churches 3-1, and the general store did its best business in whiskey and ammunition. On the eastern edge of town, where the respectable folk preferred not to venture, stood a small cabin that had seen better days. Its roof sagged under the weight of snow, and gaps between the logs had been stuffed with rags and mud. This was home to Nora Whitmore, though home seemed too generous a word for such a place. Inside, Nora worked at mending a torn dress by the light of a single candle. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency despite the cold that seeped through every crack. At 27, she possessed the kind of beauty that hardship had refined rather than destroyed. Her auburn hair, pinned up in a practical bun, caught the candlelight like burnished copper. But it was her eyes that told her story. Deep brown, steady, holding a strength that circumstances hadn't managed to break. She shifted in her chair, wincing as her left leg protested. The limb, twisted from knee to ankle, bore the permanent reminder of the accident that had changed everything. 3 years ago, the wagon carrying her husband back from the mine had overturned on an icy road. Thomas had died instantly, crushed beneath the weight of timber and machinery. Nora, riding alongside, had been trapped for hours with her leg caught beneath the wreckage. By the time help arrived, the damage was irreversible. The townspeople had been sympathetic at first. Poor young widow, they'd whispered. Such a tragedy. But sympathy in a place like Pine Ridge had a short shelf life. When it became clear that Nora couldn't work the jobs available to women, Couldn't stand for hours washing laundry. Couldn't serve drinks in the saloons. Couldn't even walk without her distinctive limp. Sympathy curdled into something else. She became a reminder of how quickly fortune could turn, how easily any of them could fall from grace. Now she survived on what little sewing work came her way and the vegetables she managed to grow in her small garden during the brief summer months. Pride kept her from begging, and the same pride kept her walking into town with her head high, despite the whispers that followed her like shadows. The wind picked up outside, rattling the loose shutters. Nora pulled her shawl tighter and continued her work. Tomorrow was market day. She'd need to make the trek into town for supplies, though her coin purse held precious little. The grocer, Mr. Henley, had been patient with her credit, but patience, like sympathy, had its limits. Market day in Pine Ridge was one of the few times the isolated settlement showed signs of real life. Trappers came down from the mountains, their pack mules laden with furs. Loggers spent their wages on supplies and whiskey. Wives haggled over prices while their children played in the frozen mud. It was chaos, and community rolled into one. The closest thing to civilization the frontier offered. Elias arrived early, his sled pulled by 2 sturdy mules and loaded with bearskins. He preferred to complete his business quickly. Before the crowds grew thick, people meant questions, conversations, connections, all things he'd come to Montana to avoid. He made his way to Morrison's fur trading post, a squat building that smelled of tanned hide and tobacco. "Hart," Morrison called out, his florid face breaking into a merchant's smile. "Good to see you. What have you brought me?" Elias unloaded his furs in silence, letting the quality speak for itself. 3 grizzly pelts, winter thick and pristine. Morrison ran his hands through the fur, calculating prices in his head. "Fine work, as always." Morrison said, "Though I hear tell there's been trouble up in the passes. Wolves getting bold. They say, and worse." Elias grunted, uninterested in gossip. "Some of the boys from the logging camps have gone missing," Morrison continued, undeterred. "Could be the weather got 'em. Could be something else. There's talk of outlaws holing up in the mountains, waiting for spring to make their move. Men are always going missing in the mountains," Elias said, accepting the stack of bills Morrison counted out. "Mountains don't care about your plans." He left Morrison's and headed for the general store, needing supplies for the long weeks ahead. Coffee, flour, ammunition, the staples of a solitary life. The street was filling now, voices mixing with the creak of wagon wheels and the complaints of livestock. That's when he saw her. Nora made her way carefully across the frozen street, her gait uneven but determined. She carried a basket over one arm, her free hand occasionally reaching out to steady herself against a post or wall. Her coat was patched but clean, her boots worn but polished. Everything about her spoke of someone fighting to maintain dignity in the face of hardship. A group of women stood gossiping outside the milliner's shop. Their voices dropped to whispers as Nora passed, then rose again in her wake like cackling hens. One of them, Mrs. Fitzgerald, the banker's wife, made a show of gathering her skirts as if Nora's poverty might be contagious. Elias watched it all from the doorway of the general store, his expression unreadable. He'd seen courage in many forms during the war, men charging into certain death, medics working under fire, mothers defending their children. But there was something about the quiet bravery of this woman's daily battle that caught his attention. Nora entered Henley's grocery, the bell above the door announcing her arrival. Inside, the warmth from the pot-bellied stove was welcome relief from the bitter cold. "Mr." Henley looked up from his ledger, his expression shifting from welcome to wariness. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully. "Come for your weekly supplies." "Yes, Mr. Henley." Nora set her basket on the counter. "I have $3 from the sewing I did for Mrs. Patterson. I know it's not enough to clear my account, but—" "Mrs. Whitmore," Henley interrupted, his face reddening. "I'm afraid I can't extend any more credit. Times are hard for everyone. You understand?" The words hit like a physical blow, but Nora kept her expression steady. "I see. Then I'll just take what $3 will buy." She began selecting items carefully. A small bag of flour, some salt, a precious bit of coffee. Each choice was weighed against necessity. No sugar this week, no eggs. The bacon was out of the question. Elias entered the store, bringing a gust of cold air with him. He moved to the far counter, ostensibly examining ammunition, but his attention remained on the drama unfolding nearby. Henley weighed Nora's meager purchases, his discomfort obvious. "That's $2.70, he said. Nora counted out her coins carefully, then looked at her basket. "I'll put back the coffee," she said quietly. "No need." Both Nora and Henley turned to look at Elias, who had approached the counter. He placed a $20 bill beside Nora's coins. "Add it to whatever the lady needs," he told Henley. "Take what she owes from that." Nora's face flushed. "I can't accept—" "Not accepting," Elias cut her off, his voice gruff. "Paying forward an old debt. Someone helped me once when I needed it." He turned and walked out before she could protest further, collecting his own supplies quickly and loading them onto his sled. But as he prepared to leave town, he couldn't shake the image of those steady brown eyes, the dignified set of those thin shoulders, from the doorway of the grocery. Nora watched him go, pride warred with gratitude, shame with curiosity. Who was this mountain man who'd appeared like something out of a fairy tale, solving her immediate crisis with the casual generosity of someone who had enough to spare? "That's Elias Hart," Henley said, following her gaze. "Lives up in the high country. Brings in the finest pelts you ever saw. But queer as they come. Doesn't mix with folks. Doesn't talk more than he has to. They say the war touched his mind." Nora said nothing, but she memorized the broad set of those shoulders, the way he moved through the crowd like a wolf among sheep. Aware, alert, but utterly uninterested in belonging. As Elias's sled disappeared into the tree line, snow began to fall. Light at first, then heavier, as if the sky had decided to erase all trace of the day's encounters. But some things, once seen, couldn't be unseen. Some kindnesses, once given, couldn't be taken back. In her cabin that night, Nora unpacked her supplies, all of them, plus extra Henley had added once her debt was clear. Coffee, sugar, eggs, even a small piece of ham. She held the coffee tin for a long moment, thinking of gray eyes that had looked through her rather than at her, seeing something she couldn't name. 20 miles north, Elias sat by his fire, cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision. But his mind wasn't on the weapon. It was on a woman who'd faced the town's scorn with her chin up, who'd been ready to give up coffee, that most basic comfort of frontier life, rather than beg. The wind howled outside both cabins, and the snow continued to fall. Winter was tightening its grip on Montana, and with it would come tests that neither the hunter nor the widow could imagine. But for now, they existed in their separate worlds, connected only by a $20 bill and the memory of a moment when kindness had bridged the gap between two solitary souls. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing storms that buried Pine Ridge beneath drifts taller than a man. The temperature plummeted until breath froze in the air and exposed skin burned with cold. The logging camps shut down, their workers huddled in bunkhouses, burning through supplies meant to last until spring. In town, families nailed blankets over windows and burned furniture when the wood piles ran low. For Nora, each day became a battle against the elements. Her little cabin, already drafty, seemed to invite the cold through every gap and crack. Ice formed on the inside walls, and her water bucket froze solid each night despite keeping it near the stove. She wore every piece of clothing she owned, layered like armor against the cold, but still shivered as she worked. The real challenge was firewood. In better times, Thomas would have laid in a full cord before the first snow, enough to last the winter with careful management. But Nora's wood pile had dwindled to almost nothing, and the thought of venturing out to cut more filled her with dread. Her leg, always troublesome in cold weather, had stiffened to the point where each step sent shooting pains from ankle to hip. Still, Necessity drove her out into the frozen morning with an old axe and a determination born of survival. The nearest suitable trees were a quarter-mile from her cabin, a distance that might as well have been 10 miles given her condition. She made her way slowly, using a walking stick cut from a pine branch, her breath coming in painful gasps that crystallized in the air. The first tree she chose was a dead pine, its wood dry and perfect for burning. She cleared the snow from around its base and raised the axe. The first swing sent vibrations up her arms and nearly knocked her off balance. Her left leg, unable to provide proper support, buckled slightly. She caught herself against the tree, fighting back tears of frustration. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, raising the axe again. Each swing was agony, each chip of wood a small victory. What should have taken a strong man 20 minutes took her nearly 2 hours. By the time the tree finally fell, she was soaked with sweat despite the cold. Her hands blistered inside her thin gloves. Now came the harder part, cutting the trunk into manageable pieces and somehow getting them back to her cabin. She sat on the fallen tree, catching her breath, and tried not to think about how many more trees she'd need to survive the winter. High in the mountains, Elias tracked a massive grizzly through powder snow that came up to his thighs. The bear had killed 2 horses at a logging camp, and the foreman had offered a bounty for its hide. Elias didn't usually take such jobs. He preferred the clean solitude of hunting on his own terms, but the price offered would keep him in supplies through spring. The trail led him into a valley he rarely visited, where the wind had scoured the ridges bare and piled snow into drifts that could swallow a man whole. The bear was smart, doubling back on its own trail, using creek beds where the ice would hide its tracks. But Elias had spent 20 years learning the language of the wilderness. He read signs in broken twigs, in the pattern of disturbed snow, in the way ravens circled overhead. On the 3rd day of the hunt, a blizzard struck with shocking suddenness. One moment the sky was clear, the next a wall of white engulfed everything. Elias immediately sought shelter, finding a small cave beneath an overhanging cliff. He'd survived storms before, but this one had the feel of a killer, the kind that would be finding frozen bodies come spring. He built a small fire at the cave mouth, melting snow for water and gnawing on dried meat. Outside, the wind screamed like all the demons of hell had been loosed upon the mountains. Trees groaned and snapped under the weight of snow and the force of the gale. Somewhere in that maelstrom, the grizzly was probably doing exactly what Elias was, waiting it out, surviving. The storm lasted 2 days. When it finally broke, the landscape had been transformed. Familiar landmarks were buried, trails obliterated. Even Elias, with all his woodcraft, had to move carefully, testing each step. Avalanches had torn through several valleys, leaving behind jumbled fields of snow and shattered trees. He found the grizzly on the 4th day, denned up in a tangle of deadfall. The confrontation was brief and violent. The bear, made desperate by hunger and storm, charged without warning. Elias got one shot off, wounding it. Before the massive animal was on him, they rolled in the snow, the bear's claws raking his coat, its hot breath in his face. He managed to get his knife out, found the spot beneath the jaw where the blade could reach the brain. The bear died on top of him, 800 pounds of dead weight that took all his strength to shift. Elias lay in the blood-stained snow, inventory his injuries, bruised ribs, torn coat, some deep scratches that would need tending. Nothing fatal, though out here, infection could kill as surely as claws. He set about the grim work of skinning the bear, knowing he'd have to cache the meat and make multiple trips to pack it out. It was nearly dark when he made it back to his cabin, exhausted and bloody. He tended his wounds with the harsh practicality of a man used to self-reliance, pouring whiskey on the cuts and binding them with torn strips of cloth. The bearskin would bring good money. The meat would last weeks. By any measure, it had been a successful hunt. So why did he feel so empty? He knew the answer, though he tried to push it away. The image of Nora Whitmore had been haunting him for weeks now. Not just her beauty, though she was beautiful in that refined way that suffering sometimes produces. It was her dignity, her refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have crushed others. It reminded him of something he'd thought lost forever, the capacity to admire another human being. Fool, he muttered to himself, pouring another measure of whiskey. Leave it be. But leaving it be was easier said than done when a man had nothing but time and silence for company. Back in Pine Ridge. Saturday nights at the Dollar Saloon were the town's pressure valve, where loggers and miners drank away their wages and their sorrows in equal measure. The place reeked of tobacco, sweat, and cheap whiskey, and the piano player hammered out tunes that could barely be heard over the roar of conversation and argument. Nora rarely ventured out after dark, especially not near the saloon district. But Mrs. Patterson owed her $2 for a wedding dress alteration, and Mrs. Patterson's husband could usually be found at the Dollar on Saturday nights. Nora needed that money desperately. Her firewood was nearly gone, despite her painful efforts at cutting more. She waited until full dark, hoping to catch Patterson as he left rather than venture inside. She positioned herself across the street, in the shadow of the closed barber shop, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. Her leg ached from standing, but she shifted her weight and endured. The saloon doors burst open, spilling light and noise into the street. 3 men stumbled out, holding each other up, singing a bawdy song off-key. One of them was Jake Sullivan, a logger known for mean drinking and meaner fists. He spotted Nora despite the shadows, his alcohol-dulled mind taking a moment to process what he was seeing. Well, he slurred, weaving toward her. What's the cripple widow doing out so late? Come to earn some money the easy way. Nora tried to step back, but found herself against the barbershop wall. I'm waiting for Mr. Patterson. He owes me for some work. Sullivan laughed, an ugly sound. His 2 companions flanked him, grinning like wolves. Work, she says. I got some work for you. Sweetheart, pay better than sewing, and you can do it lying down. Please leave me alone. Nora's voice was steady despite her fear. She tried to sidestep, but Sullivan grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Don't be unfriendly now, he growled, pulling her closer. His breath reeked of whiskey and tobacco. A cripple like you should be grateful for the attention. Nora struck out with her free hand, catching Sullivan across the face. The slap rang out in the cold air, shocking in its defiance. Sullivan's face darkened with rage. Are you little... He raised his hand to strike back. The click of a rifle being cocked froze everyone in place. Let her go. Elias's voice came from the darkness, cold as the mountain wind. He stepped into the circle of light from the saloon, his rifle held casually but unmistakably ready. Now! Sullivan released Nora's arm, his drunk bravado warring with the very real threat of the mountain man. This ain't your business, Hart. I'm making it my business. Elias never looked at Nora, keeping his eyes on the 3 men. You boys have 2 choices. Walk away now, or I start collecting pelts of a different kind. Your call. One of Sullivan's companions tugged at his sleeve. Come on, Jake, not worth it. Sullivan spat in the snow, but allowed himself to be pulled away. This ain't over, he muttered, but it was the hollow threat of a bully who'd been faced down. Elias waited until they disappeared back into the saloon before lowering his rifle. Only then did he turn to Nora, his gray eyes unreadable in the dim light. You shouldn't be out here alone. I had business, Nora said, her chin lifting despite her trembling. I don't need... You need to get home, Elias interrupted. Streets aren't safe for a woman alone, especially not you. The words stung, even though Nora knew he meant her vulnerability. Not any failing on her part. Thank you for your help, she said stiffly. I can manage from here. Elias studied her for a long moment, then nodded. See that you do. He turned and melted back into the darkness, leaving Nora alone with her pride and her fear. She made her way home slowly, her leg protesting every step. The $2 from Patterson would have to wait for another day. In her cabin, she barred the door and sat by her dying fire, shaking not entirely from cold. The memory of Sullivan's hands, his words, made her feel dirty in a way that had nothing to do with actual dirt. But there was another memory, too. Elias Hart, materializing from the darkness like some avenging angel. His quiet threat more effective than any amount of shouting would have been. She'd been rescued twice now by a man who wanted nothing from her, who seemed to actively avoid human connection. It was a puzzle her tired mind couldn't solve. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling her shutters and finding every gap in the walls. Nora fed the last of her wood to the fire, knowing it wouldn't last the night. Tomorrow she'd have to try again to cut more. Injured pride and aching leg be damned. Survival didn't care about pain or dignity. It only cared about the next breath, the next sunrise, the next small victory against the overwhelming odds. But as she prepared for bed, bundling herself in every blanket she owned, Nora found herself thinking not of tomorrow's struggles, but of gray eyes that held winter storms and unexpected kindness. Somewhere in the mountains, Elias Hart was probably sitting by his own fire, as alone as she was. The thought should have been depressing. Instead, it was oddly comforting, knowing that someone else out there understood the weight of solitude, the price of survival. The winter was far from over, and darker days lay ahead. But for tonight, she was safe. She was warm enough, and she was not entirely forgotten. In a place like Pine Ridge, in a winter like this, that was almost enough. The morning after the incident at the saloon, Nora woke to find a cord of split firewood stacked neatly beside her cabin. No note, no sign of who had left it, but she knew. The wood was cut with expert precision, each piece the perfect size for her small stove. She stood in the doorway, her breath misting in the frigid air, torn between gratitude and something that felt dangerously close to humiliation. Pride demanded she refuse the gift, but practicality won. She was down to burning furniture, and pride wouldn't keep her warm. Still, she couldn't accept such charity without acknowledgement. That afternoon, she baked 2 loaves of bread with the last of her good flour, wrapped them carefully, and set out for the mountains. The journey to Elias's cabin took 3 hours of painful progress. She'd never been that far into the wilderness, but the direction was common knowledge. Follow Miller's Creek north until it forked, then bear east toward the tall pine ridge. The snow was deep. Her leg protested every step, but she pressed on with the same determination that had carried her through 3 years of widowhood. She found the cabin by its smoke, a thin gray line rising straight in the still air. It was smaller than she'd imagined, but solidly built, with thick walls and a steep roof to shed snow. Bear pelts stretched on frames beside the door, and snowshoes hung under the eaves. Everything about it spoke of competent self-sufficiency. Nora knocked, her knuckles stinging against the cold wood. For a long moment, there was no response. Then the door opened, and Elias filled the frame, his expression shifting from wariness to surprise. "Mrs. Whitmore." His voice held a note she couldn't identify. "What are you doing here?" "I came to thank you," she said, holding out the wrapped bread. "For the firewood. Don't know what you're talking about." But his eyes betrayed him, sliding away from hers. "Please," Nora said quietly. "I need to do this. I can't. I need to give something back." He stood aside reluctantly, and she entered the cabin. It was warm, almost hot after the bitter cold outside. The space was Spartan but clean, everything in its place. A rifle rack on one wall, shelves of supplies on another, a narrow bed in the corner. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something wild, the scent of a man who lived more outdoors than in... "You shouldn't have come," Elias said, taking the bread and setting it on the rough table. "It's dangerous, traveling alone." "Everything's dangerous for someone like me," Nora replied, a flash of bitterness breaking through. "Walking to town is dangerous. Cutting firewood is dangerous. Existing is dangerous. I can't live my life afraid of everything." "You should be afraid of some things." His gray eyes were intense. "There's worse than drunk loggers in these mountains." "You mean the outlaws people are whispering about?" Elias nodded slowly. "Found signs 2 weeks back. Group of men, maybe 6 or 7, holed up somewhere in the high passes. They're waiting for something. Spring, probably. When the road's clear and the stages run regular again. Maybe." He moved to the stove, pouring coffee from a blackened pot. He offered her a cup without asking if she wanted it. The gesture was oddly domestic, at odds with the wild surroundings. Or maybe they're waiting for the town to get desperate enough. Hungry people make easy targets. Nora wrapped her hands around the hot cup, savoring the warmth. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd been stretching for weeks. Why do you care? You've made it clear you want nothing to do with Pine Ridge. For a long moment, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Saw too many towns burned during the war, too many innocent people caught in the crossfire. Maybe I can't stop caring, much as I try. You were at Antietam, Nora said. It wasn't a question. She'd heard the rumors. His jaw tightened. Among other places, my brother died at Gettysburg. Pennsylvania volunteers. She took a sip of coffee. I used to hate the Confederates for it. Then I realized hate was just another weight to carry, and I was already carrying enough. Elias looked at her with something like respect. Most people can't let go that easy. Nothing easy about it. Nora set down her cup, preparing to leave. I should go. It'll be dark soon. Wait. The word came out harsher than he intended. He softened his tone. Storm coming. Can smell it in the air. You won't make it back before it hits. As if to prove his point, the wind suddenly picked up outside, rattling the windows. Nora looked out at the darkening sky, her heart sinking. She couldn't stay here. The impropriety of it would destroy what little reputation she had left. But the thought of being caught in a blizzard, with her bad leg. I have to try, she said. No. Elias's tone brooked no argument. You stay here tonight. I'll bed down in the storage shed. Come morning, I'll see you home safe. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm telling. He was already pulling on his coat. There's stew on the stove. Plenty of firewood. Bar the door after me. He was gone before she could protest further, leaving her alone in his space. The storm hit an hour later, a howling white fury that would have killed her if she'd been caught in it. She ate the stew venison with wild onions and herbs she couldn't identify, and tried not to think about the man freezing in a shed to preserve her honor. In the morning, the world was transformed. Snow had drifted to the cabin's windows, and the trees wore heavy white coats. Elias appeared at dawn, frost in his beard but seemingly none the worse for his night in the cold. He'd already dug a path to the door. Trail will be rough, he said, handing her a pair of snowshoes. These'll help some. The journey back took twice as long as her trip out. Elias broke trail, moving with the easy grace of someone born to the wilderness. He slowed his pace to match hers without comment, and when she stumbled, he steadied her with a hand that disappeared the moment she found her balance. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable. Nora found herself stealing glances at him, noting the way he read the landscape like a book, how he moved through the forest without disturbing so much as a branch. This was his world, and in it, he was utterly at home. They were within sight of Pine Ridge when they heard the gunshots. Elias stopped instantly, head cocked, listening. More shots, from the direction of town, and the faint sound of shouting. His face hardened. Stay here, he ordered, checking his rifle. Like hell, Nora shot back, surprising them both with her vehemence. That's my town, too. He looked ready to argue, then nodded curtly. Stay behind me. Do exactly as I say. They approached carefully, using the trees for cover. The scene that greeted them was chaos. A group of armed men had surrounded Henley's store, while others were loading supplies onto horses. The outlaws had come down from the mountains, just as Elias had predicted. Most of the townspeople were huddled in doorways, too frightened to intervene. One outlaw stood guard outside the store, rifle at the ready. Elias studied the situation, calculating angles and odds. 7 men that he could see, maybe more inside. Too many for a frontal assault. Can you shoot? He asked Nora quietly. Thomas taught me. I'm no marksman, but I can hit what I aim at. He handed her his pistol. If things go bad, you run. Understand? Before she could answer, he was moving. The guard never saw him coming. Elias materialized behind him like a ghost, bringing the rifle butt down hard. The man crumpled silently. One down. The next few minutes were controlled chaos. Elias moved through the outlaws like death itself, using surprise and superior positioning. His rifle spoke 3 times. 3 men fell. The remaining outlaws, caught off guard, scrambled for cover. That's when things went wrong. One of the outlaws grabbed Mrs. Patterson, who'd been caught on the street. He held her as a shield, pistol to her head. "Drop the rifle," he shouted, "or the woman dies." Elias stood in the open, rifle lowered but ready. "Let her go. Take what you want and ride out." "I don't think so." The outlaw was young, nervous, dangerous. "You killed my brothers. Think I'll kill a few townspeople in trade." The shot came from behind Elias. Nora, who'd circled around using the buildings for cover, put a bullet in the outlaw's shoulder. He spun, releasing Mrs. Patterson, and Elias finished it with cold efficiency. The remaining 2 outlaws fled on horseback, leaving their dead behind. The whole thing had lasted less than 5 minutes. As the townspeople emerged, tentative and shocked, Elias was already moving to leave, but Mayor Collins intercepted him. "Mr. Hart, the town owes you—" "Town owes me nothing," Elias cut him off. "Just happened to be here." But his eyes found Nora in the crowd, and something passed between them. She stood straight despite her exhaustion, the borrowed pistol still in her hand, and he saw in her the same steady courage that had stopped that outlaw. Not the desperate bravery of combat, but the deeper courage of someone who chose to stand when running would have been easier. He left without another word, disappearing into the forest. But Nora knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that something fundamental had shifted. The wall he'd built around himself had cracked, just a little, and she had the strangest feeling that her own walls, the ones that kept her safe but alone, were beginning to crumble too. That night, as she lay in her bed listening to the wind, she thought about the day's events. She'd walked into danger with a man she barely knew, had shot someone to save a woman who'd snubbed her on the street, had felt more alive in those terrifying moments than she had in 3 years. But mostly, she thought about the look in Elias Hart's eyes when he'd watched her stand her ground. It was recognition. She realized. One warrior acknowledging another. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, wrapped in blankets that still smelled faintly of wood smoke and wilderness, she smiled. The storm struck 3 days after the outlaw attack, worse than any Pine Ridge had seen in a decade. It began with fat, lazy flakes that quickly turned into a horizontal wall of white. By nightfall, the wind was screaming like a living thing, driving snow through every crack and crevice. Nora huddled by her stove, feeding it carefully hoarded wood. The supply Elias had left was holding, but she used it sparingly, never knowing when another blizzard might strike. She'd learned to live with cold as a constant companion, wearing layers upon layers, moving from bed to stove and back again. On the second night of the storm, she woke to a sound that wasn't wind. Something was scratching at her door, not knocking, scratching. She lay frozen, listening. There it was again, accompanied by a low whine. Cautiously, she crept to the window and peered out. In the swirling snow, she could barely make out a dark shape huddled against her door. Not human, too low to the ground. A dog? No, larger. Against every instinct, she unbarred the door and cracked it open. A wolf collapsed into her cabin, its gray fur matted with blood and snow. Nora's first impulse was to scream, to drive it back out into the storm. But something in the animal's eyes, pain, exhaustion, a weary acceptance of whatever fate she chose, stopped her. "Lord help me, I must be mad," she muttered, closing the door. The wolf didn't move, barely seemed to breathe. In the lamplight, she could see the wound's claw marks along its flank, probably from a fight with another predator. It was young, not fully grown, and desperately thin. Nora had nursed injured animals before, back when Thomas was alive, never a wolf. But the principles were the same. Warm them up, clean the wounds, provide food and water. Let nature do the rest. She worked through the night, her fear gradually replaced by focus. The wolf submitted to her ministrations with surprising docility, as if it understood she was trying to help. By dawn, it was sleeping by her stove, bandaged and breathing easier. "What am I going to do with you?" she asked the sleeping animal. "Can't keep a wolf. Can barely keep myself." 20 miles north, Elias fought his own battle with the storm. He'd been checking his trap lines when the blizzard hit, forcing him to take shelter in a shallow cave. For 2 days he waited, sustained by the emergency supplies he always carried, listening to the storm's fury. But his mind wasn't on survival. That came as naturally as breathing. Instead, he found himself thinking about Nora Whitmore, alone in that drafty cabin. He'd reinforced some of the worst gaps during his firewood delivery, but the place was still a sieve. And if she ran out of wood, not your problem, he told himself for the 100th time. But the words rang hollow. On the 3rd morning, the storm broke. Elias emerged from his shelter into a world scoured clean, where snowdrifts had reshaped the landscape into something alien. Trees had snapped under the weight of snow, and he could see where avalanches had carved new paths down the mountainsides. He should head home, check his cabin, tend his own needs. Instead, he found himself turning south, toward Pine Ridge. The journey took most of the day, fighting through drifts that came up to his chest in places. As he neared town, he saw the damaged roofs collapsed under snow weight, chimneys toppled, livestock frozen in the fields. Pine Ridge looked like it had been through a war. He went to Nora's cabin first, telling himself he was just checking on the firewood situation. The smoke rising from her chimney was a relief, but he knocked anyway. "Who is it?" Her voice came muffled through the door. "Elias Hart." There was a long pause, then the sound of the bar being lifted. She opened the door a crack, and he saw her eyes widen. "You need to stay calm," she said quietly, and moved very slowly. That's when he saw the wolf. It stood beside her, hackles slightly raised, yellow eyes fixed on him. Elias's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, then stopped. The wolf was bandaged, clearly injured, and Nora's hand rested on its head. "You took in a wolf." It wasn't a question. "She was hurt," Nora said simply. "I couldn't leave her to die. It's a wild animal. Could turn on you in a heartbeat." "So could any man." Her chin lifted in that way he was beginning to recognize. "She's shown me more kindness than most humans." Elias entered slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The wolf watched him but didn't growl. Up close, he could see it was female, young, probably separated from her pack during the storm. "You realize what you've done?" he asked. "Wolves don't forget kindness. She'll likely keep coming back." "Would that be so terrible?" Nora moved to the stove, gesturing for him to sit. "Coffee?" As she poured, Elias studied the small space. She'd made improvements, cloth stuffed in the worst cracks, furniture arranged to best conserve heat. But it was still inadequate. Still a place where one bad storm could mean death. "Why did you come?" she asked, setting a cup before him. "Storm was bad. Wanted to check." He paused, unused to explaining himself. "Wanted to make sure you weathered it." "As you can see, I survived." She sat across from him, the wolf settling at her feet. "Though I appreciate the concern." They drank coffee in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The wolf dozed, occasionally opening one eye to check on the stranger. Outside, they could hear the town stirring, people calling to each other, beginning the long work of digging out. "Tell me about the war," Nora said suddenly. "Not the battles. Tell me about after—" Elias stiffened. "Not much to tell. Please." Her brown eyes were steady on his. I think you might be the only person who understands. Thomas came back from his first enlistment changed. He drank, had nightmares, couldn't stand sudden noises. Then he re-enlisted anyway. Said he couldn't explain why. He died in that wagon accident before he could find his way back to who he'd been. Maybe there was no going back. The words came out rough. War doesn't just take your friends, your health. Takes pieces of who you are. Leaves holes nothing can fill. Some men try to fill them with whiskey or violence. Some just leave. Find a place where the holes don't matter so much. Is that what you did? Found a place where the holes don't matter? He looked at her sharply, but there was no judgment in her face, just understanding, and something that might have been shared sorrow. Thought I had, he admitted. Mountains don't care about your past. Don't ask questions. Don't demand things you can't give. Just survive or don't. Simple. But not enough. Was enough for 15 years. He stood abruptly, uncomfortable with how much he'd revealed. Should check the roof, make sure the weight hasn't damaged the beams. She let him retreat into action, watching as he examined the cabin's structure with a critical eye. The wolf watched too, head tilted as if puzzled by human behavior. Elias found several problems. Beams bowing under snow weight, gaps where the wind had driven snow into the walls. He set to work without asking permission, using tools from his pack to shore up the worst damage. You don't have to, Nora began. Needs doing. He didn't look at her. No point surviving a wolf attack just to have your roof cave in. As he worked, Nora talked. Not about anything important, just stories of the town, observations about the weather, memories of summers when wildflowers covered the meadows. Her voice was soothing, filling the silence without demanding response. The wolf eventually rose and limped over to investigate what he was doing. Elias tensed, but the animal just sniffed his boots before returning to Nora's side. She likes you, Nora observed. She tolerates me. There's a difference. Sometimes tolerance is the first step toward trust. Their eyes met across the small space, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or possibility. Then Elias returned to his work, and the moment passed. By late afternoon, he'd done what he could. The cabin was more secure, though still far from ideal. As he prepared to leave, Nora stopped him with a touch on his arm. Thank you, she said, for checking on me. For the repairs, for talking. He nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude as always. Storm damaged lots of homes. Yours was just closest. She smiled, seeing through the lie but letting it stand. Of course. As he reached the door, she spoke again. Elias, what filled the holes? Even a little? He paused, hand on the latch. Nothing filled them, but maybe finding someone else who understands them helps. He left before she could respond, disappearing into the white landscape. Nora stood in the doorway, watching until he was out of sight. The wolf pressed against her leg, whining softly. I know, she murmured. I feel it too. That night, as she lay in bed with the wolf curled on the floor beside her, Nora thought about holes that couldn't be filled, about the empty space beside her where Thomas used to sleep, about the children she'd never have, about the life she'd planned that had crumbled like spring ice. But she also thought about gray eyes that held winter storms and understanding, about hands that built and repaired instead of destroying, about a man who'd carved out a life in the wilderness because civilization had no place for what he'd become. Maybe Elias was right. Maybe the holes never filled. But maybe, just maybe, two people with matching wounds could build something new in the spaces between. The wolf stirred in its sleep, chasing dream prey. Outside, the wind had calmed, leaving only the quiet of deep snow and distant stars. Somewhere in the mountains, a lonely man sat by his fire, fighting the urge to return to a drafty cabin where a brave woman had tamed a wolf and threatened to tame him too. Winter was far from over. The worst storms might still be ahead, but for the first time in years, neither of them faced it entirely alone. The wolf healed slowly but steadily, and with each passing day, the bond between her and Nora grew stronger. The townspeople whispered. Of course, the crippled widow had finally gone mad, taking in a wild beast. But Nora had stopped caring about whispers long ago. She named the wolf Luna, for her silver coat that shone like moonlight. It was during a supply run to town that Nora first heard the rumors about the remaining outlaws. Jake Sullivan, still nursing his wounded pride from their encounter, was holding court at the general store. 5 of them, holed up in Devil's Canyon, he was saying. Sheriff's too yellow to go after them. Says we should wait for the federal marshals come spring. Spring's 2 months away, another man protested. They'll pick us clean by then. Nora collected her meager supplies, trying to ignore the conversation. But as she turned to leave, Sullivan blocked her path. Heard you're keeping a wolf now. He sneered. Figures a woman like you would prefer the company of beasts. At least beasts are honest about what they are, Nora replied coolly. Excuse me. He didn't move. Your mountain man friend ain't here to protect you today. I don't need protection. She met his eyes steadily. Move, or I'll show you what this cripple can do with a walking stick. Something in her gaze made him step aside, though he muttered curses as she passed. Nora left the store with her head high, but inside, worry gnawed at her. 5 outlaws, desperate and dangerous, with no law coming until spring. That evening, Elias appeared at her door. He'd taken to checking on her weekly, though he always found some practical excuse, fixing a hinge, bringing meat from a recent hunt, examining Luna's healing wounds. Heard about the outlaws, he said without preamble. You need to be careful. The whole town needs to be careful. Nora set a bowl of stew before him, a routine they'd fallen into. But nobody's doing anything about it. Not our problem. She looked at him sharply. Since when is 5 men terrorizing innocent people not our problem? Since getting involved means getting killed. His voice was flat. I've seen what men like that do to anyone who stands against them. Better to wait them out. Like the town waited out the last group. How many would have died if you hadn't acted? That was different. How? He didn't answer, focusing on his stew. Luna padded over, sitting beside him. She'd accepted his presence completely now, even seeming to welcome it. You know Devil's Canyon, Nora pressed. You could find their camp. Knowing where they are and doing something about it are 2 different things. He looked up at her. What are you suggesting? That I take on 5 armed men alone? Not alone. The words hung between them. Elias set down his spoon carefully. No, I can shoot. You know I can. And I know these mountains better than any townsperson except you. Your leg has never stopped me from doing what needs to be done. Her jaw set stubbornly. Those men are a plague. They'll kill someone eventually. Probably someone who can't defend themselves. A child, maybe, or an old person. Can you live with that? His silence was answer enough. 3 nights later, they set out under cover of darkness. Elias had argued, threatened, even pleaded, something she'd never thought to see. But Nora's resolve was iron. If he went alone and died, she'd reasoned, she'd never forgive herself. At least together they had a chance. Luna wanted to follow, whining when Nora ordered her to stay. But a wolf, even a tame one, would be a liability where they were going. They moved through the forest like ghosts, Elias leading, Nora following in his footsteps. Her leg ached fiercely, but she gritted her teeth and pushed on. The plan was simple. Find the outlaw camp, assess their defenses, and return with information the sheriff could use to organize a proper posse. Devil's Canyon lived up to its name. Steep walls of rock channeled the wind into howling gusts, and ice made every surface treacherous. But it was the perfect hiding place, defensible, with multiple escape routes for those who knew them. They smelled the smoke first, then saw the glow of firelight against the canyon walls. Elias motioned for silence, and they crept closer, using boulders for cover. The outlaw camp was larger than expected. Not just 5 men, but 8, with horses picketed nearby and supplies stacked under tarps. They were well armed, well provisioned, ready for a long stay. Too many, Elias breathed in her ear. We go back, now. But as they began to retreat, a shout went up. One of the sentries had spotted movement. Suddenly, the camp exploded into action. Men grabbing rifles, spreading out to search. Run, Elias commanded. Pushing Nora ahead of him, they fled through the darkness, gunshots echoing off the canyon walls. Nora's leg betrayed her on an ice-slicked stone, sending her sprawling. Elias hauled her up, half carrying her as bullets whined past. They almost made it. The canyon mouth was just ahead when a figure stepped out from behind a boulder. Rifle raised, no time to think, only react. Nora drew the pistol Elias had given her and fired. The man spun and fell. More outlaws appeared, cutting off their escape. Elias pushed Nora behind a rock outcropping and turned to face them, his rifle speaking death in the darkness. But there were too many, coming from too many directions. "Go!" he shouted over the gunfire. "Get to town! Bring help! I'm not leaving you!" A bullet struck the rock beside her head, showering them with fragments. Elias grabbed her shoulders, his eyes blazing. "You want to help? Then live! Go!" Before she could protest, he was moving, drawing their fire, leading them away from her. Nora watched in horror as he disappeared into the maze of rocks, pursued by at least 4 men. She wanted to follow, to fight beside him, but she knew he was right. Their only chance was if she could bring reinforcements. She ran, pushing through pain that threatened to drop her with every step, following the trail back toward Pine Ridge. Behind her, the gunfire intensified, then suddenly stopped. The silence was worse than the shooting. She stumbled into town at dawn, nearly delirious with exhaustion and fear. Her shouts brought people running, including Sheriff Watson, a man who'd been content to wait for federal help. "Elias Hart is holding off 8 outlaws in Devil's Canyon," she gasped. "If we don't help him now, he'll die." To his credit, Watson acted quickly. Within an hour, he'd assembled a posse of 20 men, including some who'd previously scorned both Elias and Nora. Even Jake Sullivan volunteered, shamed perhaps by the courage of those he'd mocked. They rode hard for Devil's Canyon, Nora insisting on coming despite her exhaustion. As they neared the canyon, they heard gunshots, sparse, deliberate. Elias was still alive, still fighting. What followed was a battle that would be talked about in Pine Ridge for generations. The posse swept into the canyon like an avenging flood, catching the outlaws between Elias's position and their guns. The fight was fierce but brief, outnumbered now, facing determined townsmen instead of frightened victims. The outlaws quickly surrendered. They found Elias holed up in a natural fortress of rocks, wounded but alive. He'd been shot twice, shoulder and thigh, but had managed to hold off his pursuers for hours, picking his positions carefully, making every bullet count. When he saw Nora with the posse, his expression was a mix of relief and fury. "I told you to run," he said. "I did," she replied, right to help. The journey back to town was a triumph. The outlaws were locked up to await the marshals. The stolen goods recovered. The threat ended. But Nora cared nothing for the celebration. Her focus was entirely on the man who'd bled for strangers he claimed not to care about. They took him to her cabin over his protests. The doctor, old Samuel Crenshaw, worked through the day extracting bullets and stitching wounds. Elias endured it all in stoic silence, but his eyes never left Nora's face. When the doctor finally left, promising to return in the morning, they were alone except for Luna, who'd taken up guard duty by the door. "You could have died," Nora said softly, checking his bandages. "So could you." His hand caught hers. "When I saw you fall, when that outlaw had his gun on you. But we didn't die," she interrupted. "We survived, together." He studied her face. This woman who'd dragged herself miles on a crippled leg to save him, who'd stood beside him against impossible odds. "Your bare courage," he said wonderingly. "It brings me to my knees." Tears sprang to her eyes. "Elias, I came to these mountains to escape," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Thought if I could just be alone enough, cold enough, hard enough, I could forget what it felt like to care. Then you," he shook his head, "you with your bad leg and your tame wolf and your refusal to give up. You made me remember why some things are worth fighting for." Nora leaned down, pressing her forehead to his. "You saved me first," she whispered. "Not just from Sullivan or the storm or poverty. You saved me from becoming what they expected, a broken thing, waiting to die. You saw strength where everyone else saw weakness, because it was there to see. His hand cupped her face. It was always there. Luna whined softly, and they looked over to see her tail wagging, as if she approved of what was happening. Even the wolf knows, Elias murmured, and for the first time since Nora had known him, he smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered face. "Rest now," she said, though she didn't move away. "We have time, all the time we need." As he drifted into healing sleep, Nora sat beside him, their hands entwined. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside, the cabin was warm with more than just fire. It was warm with possibility, with hope, with the first stirrings of a love born from courage and forged in understanding. The worst of winter might still lie ahead, but they would face it as they'd faced the outlaws, together, each drawing strength from the other's bravery. And in the end, that would be enough to see them through to spring. The attack came on a moonless night in late February, when winter's grip showed no sign of loosening. Nora woke to Luna's low growl, a sound she'd never heard from the wolf before. In the darkness, she could sense rather than see Luna's bristling form by the door. "What is it, girl?" she whispered, reaching for the rifle Elias had insisted she keep loaded by her bed. The answer came in the form of shattering glass as her window exploded inward. Men's voices, rough with drink and malice, surrounded the cabin. She recognized Jake Sullivan's slurred tones among them. "Come on out, widow woman. Time to pay for making fools of us." Nora's mind raced. Elias was at his cabin, 20 miles away. The town was asleep. She was alone, except for Luna, facing unknown numbers of men bent on revenge. She fired through the broken window, heard a yelp of pain, but return fire immediately peppered the cabin walls, forcing her to duck. Luna snarled, ready to attack, but Nora held her back. The wolf would die uselessly against armed men. "You got lucky once," Sullivan shouted, "but your mountain man ain't here now, and we got all night." More gunfire erupted, bullets punching through the thin walls. Nora crawled to her ammunition box, trying to count muzzle flashes. At least 4 men, maybe more. Too many. A torch sailed through the broken window, landing on her bed. The dry blankets caught immediately. Another torch followed, then another. They were going to burn her out. Nora fought the flames with her water bucket, but more torches kept coming. Smoke filled the cabin, choking thick. Luna whined, pressing against her leg. They had to get out or burn alive. She grabbed her coat and what ammunition she could carry. "When I open this door," she told Luna, "you run, find Elias, go!" The wolf seemed to understand, her yellow eyes gleaming in the firelight. Nora flung open the door and dove sideways, firing as she went. Luna streaked past her into the darkness, a gray ghost vanishing into the forest. Gunfire followed the wolf, but she was already gone. Nora made it to the woodpile before a bullet caught her in the side, spinning her around. She fell hard, gasping at the white-hot pain. Blood soaked through her dress, warm against the frozen ground. Sullivan emerged from the shadows, revolver aimed at her head. "Should have minded your own business," he said. "Should have known your place." Behind him, her cabin was fully engulfed, flames reaching toward the star-filled sky. Everything she owned, every memory of her life with Thomas, turning to ash. "My place," she said through gritted teeth, "is standing against cowards like you." His face contorted with rage. He cocked the hammer. The rifle shot came from the darkness, taking Sullivan in the chest. He looked down in surprise at the spreading red stain, then toppled backward. More shots followed, devastatingly accurate. The attackers scattered, firing wildly into the night, but their ambusher was a ghost, shooting and moving. Never were they expected. Elias emerged from the shadows like death incarnate. He'd run 20 miles after Luna arrived at his cabin, her frantic behavior telling him everything he needed to know. Now he moved through Nora's attackers with cold efficiency, the war-hardened soldier fully awakened. 2 men tried to flank him. He dropped them both before they could aim. Another charged with a knife. Elias sidestepped and struck him down with his rifle butt. The last attacker threw down his gun and ran, disappearing into the forest. Then Elias was kneeling beside Nora, his hands gentle despite the violence he'd just dealt. "Let me see," he said, pulling aside her blood-soaked coat. "Just a scratch." She tried to joke, but ended up coughing. The pain was spreading, cold following in its wake. "We need to stop the bleeding." He tore strips from his own shirt, packing the wound. "Can you ride? Do I have a choice?" He lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her to hold her steady. Luna appeared from the forest, blood on her muzzle that wasn't her own. At least one of the fleeing attackers hadn't escaped after all. The ride to town was a nightmare of pain and jostling. Nora drifted in and out of consciousness, held safe in Elias's arms. She heard him talking, his voice rough with fear he couldn't quite hide. "Stay with me," he kept saying. "You survived worse than this. You're too stubborn to die now." "Not stubborn," she managed. "Just have things to live for." His arms tightened around her. "So do I. For the first time in 20 years. So do I." They burst into Pine Ridge like a storm. Elias's shouts woke the doctor, the sheriff, half the town. As Crenshaw worked to save Nora's life, the story spread. How Jake Sullivan and his cronies had tried to murder the widow Whitmore. How Elias Hart had appeared like an avenging angel. How a tame wolf had run 20 miles to bring help. Sheriff Watson formed a posse to hunt the survivors, but Elias didn't join them. He sat beside Nora's bed in the doctor's house, holding her hand, his eyes never leaving her face. "The cabin's gone," she said when she woke, voice weak but clear. "Cabins can be rebuilt. Everything I had, you have what matters. You're alive." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "When I saw the flames, when Luna came running, I thought I'd lost you before I could tell you." "Tell me what?" He struggled with words. This man more comfortable with silence. "That you brought me back to life. That your courage, your strength, your refusal to break, it broke through every wall I'd built. That I love you, Nora Whitmore. And if you'll have me, I want to face whatever comes next together." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "Even if what comes next is rebuilding from nothing, even with my leg, my struggles, all the hardship ahead, especially then." He leaned close, his forehead touching hers. "We've both been broken, but maybe broken things can be stronger when they're mended together." "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to all of it." The next days passed in a blur of healing and planning. The town, shamed by the attack on someone they'd failed to protect, rallied around Nora. Donations poured in, lumber, tools, hands willing to help rebuild, even Mrs. Fitzgerald, the banker's wife who'd once gathered her skirts to avoid Nora's poverty, arrived with blankets and a sincere apology. But it was Elias who took charge of the rebuilding, and not at the site of Nora's old cabin. Instead, he chose a spot halfway between town and his mountain refuge, close enough for Nora to maintain her connections, far enough for his need for space. "A new start needs new ground," he explained. The cabin that rose was larger than either of their old homes, built with Elias's skill and the town's eager help. 2 rooms instead of 1, with thick walls that would stand against any storm and windows positioned to catch the morning sun. A proper hearth built from river stones, large enough to warm the whole space. A covered porch where Nora could work at her sewing even in bad weather. Luna supervised the construction, having appointed herself guardian of both humans. The wolf's presence no longer frightened the townspeople. She'd become a symbol of the wild loyalty that had saved Nora's life. As Nora healed, she and Elias talked through the long evenings, sharing stories they'd never told anyone else. He spoke of friends lost in battle, of the moment at Antietam when he'd decided that feeling nothing was better than feeling too much. She told him about the baby she'd lost before Thomas died, about the double grief that had nearly destroyed her. "We're both carrying ghosts," she said one evening as they sat before the new hearth. "Maybe that's okay." Elias replied, "Ghosts are just love with nowhere to go. Now it has somewhere." The sheriff returned with news that the surviving attackers had been caught and would stand trial. Jake Sullivan's body was buried in the paupers section of the cemetery, unmourned except by the ravens. Justice, such as it was. had been served. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, but with increasing signs of renewal. The snow began its retreat to the highest peaks. Streams swollen with meltwater sang through the valleys, and in the meadow surrounding the new cabin, the first hardy wildflowers pushed through the lingering white. On a morning when the air held the first real warmth of the season, Elias found Nora on the porch, working at her mending. Luna dozed at her feet, content in the sunshine. The scene was so peaceful, so perfectly what he'd never dared hope for, that he stopped just to memorize it. Nora looked up, smiling. "What is it?" "Just thinking about that day in the market, when you could barely afford coffee, and a strange mountain man paid my debts." Her smile deepened. "I was so proud, so ready to refuse help from anyone. Your pride was part of what caught my attention. That and your courage. My bare courage, you once said. It brought me to my knees," he confirmed, crossing to kneel beside her chair. "And I find I don't want to get up." She set aside her sewing, cupping his weathered face in her hands. "Then don't. Stay right here, with me, with us." He caught her hands, pressing kisses to each palm. "Always." Luna opened one eye, gave a satisfied huff, and went back to sleep. Around them, the mountains stood eternal guard, no longer barriers but protectors of the life they were building together. The cabin stood strong against the backdrop of peaks and pines, a testament to what two broken people could create when they chose to heal together. There would be other challenges, summer droughts and winter storms, the lingering pain of old wounds both physical and spiritual. But they would face them as they'd learned to face everything, together, with courage laid bare and love strong enough to bring the strongest to their knees. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Not just survival, but the choice to truly live again, to risk the heart once more. And in that choice, they found their redemption. Dawn broke gray and bitter over Pine Ridge, the kind of morning that promised nothing good. Elias stood on the porch of their cabin, rifle in hand, watching the tree line. Beside him, Luna's hackles rose as she scented something on the wind. "How many?" Nora asked from the doorway, her own weapon ready. "More than before." His voice was grim. "Maybe 15, 20 riders, moving fast from the north." They'd known this was coming. The survivors of the original outlaw band had joined forces with a larger gang, led by a man called Black Tom Garrison. Word had filtered down from the logging camps. Garrison blamed Elias for his brother's death in the first raid and was coming for revenge. "The town?" Nora asked. "They'll hit us first. We're isolated, easier target." Elias turned to her. "You could still go. Take Luna. Ride for Pine Ridge. We've had this discussion." Her brown eyes flashed. "I'm not leaving." He'd known she'd say that, but he'd had to try. In the weeks since spring arrived, they'd fortified the cabin as best they could. Thick shutters for the windows, water barrels inside, ammunition stocked, but 20 men. "They'll try to surround us," Elias said, thinking aloud. "Use the forest for cover. We need to control where they can approach." They spent the next hours in frantic preparation. Elias had learned a thing or two about defensive positions during the war. They created clear fields of fire, set up fallback positions, prepared torches in case of night attack. Nora worked beside him without complaint, her limp barely noticeable now after months of healing. It was midday when Sheriff Watson arrived with 5 men, all he could spare from defending the town itself. "Federal marshals are 3 days out," he reported. "If we can hold until then, 3 days might as well be 3 years." Elias said bluntly, "But we're grateful for what help you brought." They positioned the men carefully. 2 in the barn with a clear view of the eastern approach. 2 more behind the wood pile covering the west. Watson and his deputy took the north. Elias and Nora would hold the cabin itself, their last line of defense. The attack came at dusk, announced by the crack of rifles from the forest edge. Garrison had split his forces, hitting from 3 sides at once. The defenders returned fire, but they were badly outnumbered. "Here they come!" someone shouted. Riders burst from the trees, firing as they came. Elias dropped two before they covered half the distance. Beside him, Nora's rifle spoke steadily, each shot carefully aimed. Luna paced between them, whining with the need to attack. The outlaws reached the barn first. A fierce firefight erupted, muzzle flashes lighting the gathering darkness. One of Watson's men went down. Then another. The survivors fell back toward the cabin. "Inside," Elias commanded. Covering their retreat, they barricaded themselves in as bullets splintered the door and shutters. Through the gun slots, Elias had cut. They could see outlaws taking positions all around. They were surrounded. "Well," Nora said with dark humor, reloading her rifle, "at least we don't have to wonder which direction they'll come from." The night became a nightmare of probing attacks and desperate defense. The outlaws tried to rush the cabin twice, driven back each time with losses. But the defenders were taking casualties too. Watson was hit in the shoulder, his deputy killed trying to stop a breach of the back window. During a lull, Garrison's voice rang out. "Hart, send out the woman and the rest can go free. This is between you and me." "Go to hell," Nora shouted back before Elias could respond. "Brave words from a cripple." Garrison taunted. "How long before your ammunition runs out? How long before we burn you out like we did your first shack?" Elias felt Nora tense beside him. Fire, their greatest fear. The cabin was stronger than her old one, but still vulnerable to flame. "When they come again," he told her quietly, "they'll use torches. We need to be ready." But the next attack brought a different horror. The outlaws had captured one of the men from the barn, wounded but alive. They dragged him into view of the cabin. "Last chance, Hart," Garrison called. "Come out, or we start cutting pieces off your friend here." The captured man, Peterson, a young logger who'd volunteered to help, tried to shout something, but a blow silenced him. Elias stood slowly. "No," Nora gasped, grabbing his arm. "I won't let them torture him because of me." Elias said, "When I go out, you bar this door and—" The shot came from the forest, taking one of Peterson's captors in the head. Then more shots, from different angles, and suddenly the clearing erupted in chaos. "What in blazes?" Watson exclaimed. "Through the window." They could see the outlaws scattering, firing wildly into the woods, but their attackers were ghosts, shooting and moving, never staying still. Familiar tactics, Elias realized with a start. "Cover them!" he shouted, firing through the gun slots at the confused outlaws. The battle turned in moments, caught between the cabin's defenders and the unknown attackers. Garrison's men broke and ran. Some made it to their horses and fled. Others fell where they stood. Black Tom Garrison himself went down with bullets from 3 different directions. As the last gunfire died away, figures emerged from the forest. Elias's heart nearly stopped when he recognized the lead man, Samuel Carson, his sergeant from the war, grizzled now but unmistakable. "Eli, you son of a gun!" Carson called out. "Don't shoot. We're friendly." Elias unbarred the door, stepping out cautiously. Behind Carson were 6 more men, all carrying themselves with the easy competence of veteran soldiers. "Sam, how did you—" "Got your letter last month," Carson explained, clasping Elias's hand. "The one where you mentioned maybe having some trouble coming. Figured you might need help, so I rounded up some of the boys." He grinned. "Just like old times, except now we're saving your sorry hide instead of the other way around." Elias had written to Carson months ago, a brief note ending his years of self-imposed exile, mentioning Nora and their new life. He'd never expected this. "You came all this way. What's family for?" Carson looked past him to where Nora stood in the doorway. "This the lady who finally tamed the wild man of the mountains?" Nora came forward, Luna at her side. "I'm Nora. You must be the friends Elias told me about." "Ma'am?" Carson touched his hat. "He wrote that you were brave. Seeing this setup, I believe it." He gestured to his men. "These boys and I rode with Eli through the worst of the war. When we heard he'd found someone worth fighting for again, well, we couldn't let him face it alone." The reunion was brief but warm. As the veterans secured the area and tended the wounded, Elias found himself overwhelmed. He'd cut himself off from these men, from all human connection, thinking it was the only way to survive. But they'd come anyway, crossing half the country because one of their own needed help. "I don't know how to thank you," he said to Carson. "No thanks needed." Carson's expression grew serious. "You saved every man here at least once during the war. We don't forget." He paused. "Besides, from what I saw, you and your lady were doing pretty well on your own. That was some fighting." Sheriff Watson, his shoulder bandaged, approached. "I'll be writing this up for the territorial governor," he said. "What you folks did here, Pine Ridge won't forget." As dawn broke, they counted the cost. 3 defenders dead, 4 wounded. But Garrison's gang was broken. 8 dead, including their leader. The rest scattered to the winds. The threat that had loomed over the region was ended. Carson and his men stayed to help with the aftermath. And in the days that followed, Elias found himself reconnecting with a part of his life he'd thought lost forever. These men understood the ghosts he carried because they carried their own, but they'd found ways to live with them, to build new lives without forgetting the old. "You did right, coming out here," Carson told him one evening as they sat on the porch. "Sometimes a man needs distance to find himself again, but you did even better finding her." He nodded toward where Nora was bandaging one of the wounded men, Luna watching protectively. "That's a woman worth riding through hell for. She rode through hell for me first," Elias said, "more than once. Then you're both blessed." Carson stood, stretching. "The boys and I will head out tomorrow. But Eli, don't disappear again. We lost too many friends in the war. Don't make us lose you to peace." That night, as Nora tended his minor wounds, scratches, really, but she insisted, Elias told her about Carson and the others, about bonds forged in blood and terror that apparently even 15 years of silence couldn't break. "You thought you were alone," she said softly. "But you never were. People who love you don't let go that easy." "I'm beginning to understand that." He caught her hand. "You taught me that. We taught each other?" She leaned against him, careful of his bruised ribs. "That's what partners do." Outside, Luna patrolled the perimeter, occasionally visible in the moonlight. The cabin bore new scars, bullet holes, scorch marks from where the outlaws had tried to set fires, but it stood strong, like its inhabitants. It had been tested and survived. "No more running," Elias said into the quiet night. "No more hiding. Whatever comes next, we face it head on. Together," Nora agreed. "Always together." The sun rose on a new day, painting the mountains gold and rose. In Pine Ridge, people were already talking about the Battle of Hart's Cabin, how a crippled widow and a haunted veteran had stood against impossible odds and prevailed. It would become legend in time, growing with each telling. But for Elias and Nora, sitting on their porch in the morning light, it was simpler than legend. It was the moment they truly understood that courage wasn't about facing danger alone. True courage was letting others stand beside you, accepting help when needed, and building something worth defending. The war was over, not just the outlaw threat, but the longer war they'd each been fighting against trust, against hope, against love, and in that surrender, they'd found their greatest victory. Winter's grip finally loosened its hold on Montana, and with the melting snow came a transformation that seemed to mirror the changes in Elias and Nora's lives. The meadows around their cabin burst into color purple lupines, yellow arnicas, and the delicate white blooms of mountain avens creating a tapestry that took the breath away. On a morning when the air was sweet with pine and wildflowers, Elias stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. Beside him, Nora leaned on her walking stick, though she needed it less these days. Luna ranged ahead, chasing ground squirrels with the playful energy of a creature fully healed. "It's beautiful," Nora said softly, taking in the panoramic view of mountains and forests stretching endlessly before them. "Used to come here when I first arrived." Elias replied, "Thought the emptiness would match what I felt inside. Never imagined I'd stand here feeling full." She took his hand, understanding without words. They'd both been empty vessels, drained by loss and hardship. But together, they'd found ways to fill those hollow spaces, not erasing the past, but building something new around it. The town had changed, too. The Battle of Heart's Cabin, as it was now called, had united Pine Ridge in unexpected ways. The shared danger had broken down barriers, and Nora was no longer the scorned, crippled widow. She was the woman who'd stood against outlaws, who'd tamed a wolf, who'd brought their hermit protector back to humanity. Mrs. Hart. The call came from below, where young Timothy Watson, the sheriff's son, came running up the trail. "Ma'am, the minister's here, says everything's ready." Nora smiled. They'd been married quietly by Sheriff Watson months ago, a practical arrangement during the crisis. But the town had insisted on a proper church wedding now that peace had returned. "Tell them we're coming," she called back, then turned to Elias. "Last chance to run back to your mountains. My mountains are wherever you are," he said simply. They made their way down to the church, Luna padding alongside. The whole town had turned out, cramming into the small building or standing outside. Dr. Crenshaw was there, beaming like a proud father. Carson had returned for the occasion with two of the other veterans, even Mrs. Fitzgerald stood in the front row, having become one of Nora's most vocal supporters. Reverend Mills, newly arrived from Denver, performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity. But it was the moment when Elias spoke his vows that brought tears to many eyes. "Your bare courage brought me to my knees," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "And I found that kneeling before such strength was not defeat, but victory. You taught me that the greatest courage isn't facing death, but choosing life, choosing love, choosing to trust again when everything in you says it's safer to be alone." Nora's response was equally moving. "You saw me when others looked away. You gave without asking for return. You showed me that accepting help isn't weakness, and that two broken hearts can sometimes make one whole one. I choose you, Elias Hart, today and always, in whatever storms or sunshine may come." The celebration afterward filled the main street. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family. Musicians played. Children ran between the dancers, and Luna held court among a group of fascinated youngsters who took turns petting her, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Elias and Nora stood together watching their community celebrate. It was a far cry from the isolated existence they'd both chosen before fate, and a $20 bill had brought them together. "No regrets?" Nora asked, seeing something pensive in his expression. "Only one," he said. "That it took me so long to find you, all those years I spent hiding. I could have been living. We found each other when we were meant to," she replied. "When we were ready, neither of us could have done this 3 years ago." He nodded, knowing she was right. They'd both needed to walk through their separate darknesses to appreciate the light they'd found together. Mayor Collins approached, looking somewhat sheepish. "Mr. Hart, Mrs. Hart, I wanted to say, that is, the town council wanted to say, we're sorry for how you were treated before. Ma'am, Pine Ridge failed you when you needed us most, but you never failed us. We're grateful, and we're proud to have you both as neighbors." "Thank you, Mayor," Nora said graciously. "But that's past. We're all neighbors now." As the celebration continued into the night, Elias and Nora slipped away, walking hand in hand back to their cabin. Luna followed, occasionally darting off to investigate some night sound before returning to their side. Their home stood solid and welcoming, lamplight glowing warmly in the windows. The bullet holes had been patched, the scorch marks covered with fresh paint. But like its owners, the cabin wore its scars without shame. They were proof of survival, of battles fought and won. Inside, they stood together looking out at the star-filled sky. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There was talk of the railroad coming through, of Pine Ridge growing into a proper town. Change was coming to their mountains, for better or worse. But tonight, There was peace. There was love. There was the knowledge that whatever came, they would face it together. "I love you," Elias said, the words still new enough to feel like a miracle each time he spoke them. "And I love you," Nora replied, leaning into his embrace. "My wild mountain hunter who thought he could live without human connection. Your bare courage," he murmured against her hair. "It saved us both." Outside, Luna howled softly at the moon, not a lonely sound, but one of contentment, of belonging. It was answered by wolves in the distant peaks, a reminder that wildness and civilization could exist side by side, each made stronger by the other, just as two wounded souls had found strength in their shared weakness, hope in their mutual understanding, and love in the spaces between their scars. The mountains stood eternal witness to their bond, and the stars blessed their union with their ancient light. In the end, it hadn't been about spurning or accepting, about pride or humiliation. It had been about courage, the courage to keep living when life seemed unbearable, to reach out when isolation felt safer, to love again when loss had taught the price of caring. And in that courage, bare and honest and true, they had found their salvation. Thank you all for listening to this Wild West love story. I'm curious to know where in the world you're enjoying this tale. Please share in the comments below where you're listening from so we can connect with fellow story lovers across the globe. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more heartfelt frontier stories. And share your thoughts about Elias and Nora's journey. Did their courage touch your heart as it touched mine? Let me know in the comments.